The wind curled over the plains like a hand brushing the memory off a face. It carried grit, fine as flour, dry as bone, and pressed it into the creases of Julian Kane's palms as he shoveled the hard-packed earth. His movements were slow, almost reverent. The hole wasn't deep. It didn't need to be. Inside the bundle of worn cotton was not a body, but something heavier, a locket of faded ribbon, a page torn from a letter never mailed. Relics of a life gone quiet. He knelt by the hole as the sun fell low, the sky a streaked bruise of purple and rust. He didn't cry. Not anymore. Grief had worn its way through him years ago, and now it only knocked every so often, quiet, familiar, like a neighbor who stopped asking for sugar but still passed by. His wife, Anna, had been dead 3 winters. Typhoid came quick. 1 week she was splitting kindling, hair tied back, voice rising above the wind as she called him in for stew. The next, she was whispering nonsense and trembling under quilts he couldn't pile high enough. He buried her on a morning much like this, beneath the same wind, the same silence. And he had not opened the 3rd room of the house since. Julian stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at the shallow grave and then out toward the horizon, where the land flattened into gold and gray. His face was a map of where sun-scored skin, a beard kept more by indifference than style. 30, though his bones might claim older. He adjusted the wide-brimmed hat on his head and turned back toward the house, boots pressing prints into the dust that the wind tried to erase behind him. The house stood alone. 3 rooms, a low porch, 1 shutter hanging crooked. It wasn't much, but it had stood through blizzards and bandits and the long, lean months of drought. It had seen love, too, real love, the kind that grows in silence and effort, not flowers and poems. Now it stood mostly empty, the hearth cold more days than not. Inside, the air held the faint scent of ashes and old pine. He lit the stove with practiced care and spooned beans into a tin pot. Dinner didn't take long. There was no one to impress. He ate by lamplight, chewing methodically, each bite a ritual to occupy his hands more than his hunger. Across from him, the 3rd chair remained untouched. It always did. A sound outside made him pause, just the wind knocking something loose. He resumed eating. The next morning, he hitched his mule and rode the 9 miles into Granger's Hollow. The town was smaller than it once was. The war and the dust had stripped it bare, men gone to fight, fields dried out, families turned into ghosts. Still, there was a blacksmith, a store, and a saloon with a piano missing 3 keys. Enough to keep it breathing. He kept his visits short. Supplies, feed, oil for the lanterns. He didn't stop to talk, and folks didn't stop him. They knew Jeb Kane's story well enough, and he didn't offer chapters beyond what they already told themselves. Outside the general store, he paused. Something on the post caught his eye, a flyer, curling at the edges, scrawled in red ink. 2 girls. 19 twins. Good health. Hard working. For marriage or labor. Inquire at Nolan's barn. Cash only. He stared at it a moment, the breeze tugging it loose at the corners. Then he turned away. Inside, he exchanged coins for oats and matches. Mrs. Carlyle, behind the counter, tried to smile. Cold's coming early this year, Mr. Kane. He nodded. Looks like it. She hesitated. If you ever need anything, extra hands or company. I manage, he said softly, then tipped his hat and left. Outside, the wind caught the flyer. It tore free and spun like a leaf, striking his boot and clinging there. He bent, pried it off, crumpled it without reading it again, and stuffed it in his coat pocket. Just trash. Still, he didn't throw it away. He rode home slow. The sky thickened with clouds, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled. When he reached the house, the wind had picked up, snapping the barn door against its frame. He tied the mule, closed the gate with effort, and stepped into the warmthless quiet of home. That night, he sat by the stove with the flyer in hand. It wasn't the first of its kind he'd seen. Ever since the war left boys broken or buried, there were more women than men, more mouths than money. These kinds of sales had started in shadows and worked their way to daylight. Some called them marriages. Some didn't bother with words. He didn't know why he kept reading it. He folded it, unfolded it, stared at the ink bleeding at the corners from where it had gotten wet. Twins. 19. Sold like mules. He didn't sleep well that night. Dreams came, wet fields and his voice, a child's laugh he never got to hear in waking life. The next day, he went back to town. It wasn't a decision, not really. Just a direction his feet pointed. And he let them. Nolan's barn stood on the edge of Granger's Hollow, slouched like an old man. The auction had already begun when he arrived. Low murmurs inside, the soft cries of someone trying not to sound afraid. He stepped through the doors and felt all eyes shift. He was known, and he was not the kind of man expected at such places. The auctioneer gave a nod, as though welcoming a wolf into a den of dogs. And there they were, standing on a crude wooden platform, hair matted from rain, clothes too thin for the weather. Two girls, matching in frame but not in spirit. One, taller by a sliver, stood with her chin up, jaw set like a trap. The other kept her arms crossed tightly, her eyes watching the floor as though it might open and swallow her whole. Agnes, the stepmother, oozed fake grief. Poor girls. Their mother died young, their father drank himself dumb, and now I've no way to keep them fed. I offer them here in hopes of a better life. Hard workers, both of them. Clean. Quiet when told. Bidders murmured. One man asked about dowry. Another snorted, "I'll give 30 for the pair if I can take 'em tonight." The taller girl's lip curled, but she didn't speak. Julian shifted his stance. Something was burning behind his ribs. He didn't move as the bidding began. 30. 40. A pause. Someone offered 50. The stepmother glanced toward Jeb, eyeing the coat, the boots, the weight in his silence. He raised his hand. Full price. Both. Now. The room quieted. Agnes smiled, teeth too white. "You sure, mister? That's a lot of trouble you're buying." He didn't blink. "They've seen worse, I figure." Paper changed hands. No handshakes. Just motion, fast and final. The girls were led down from the platform. The one who hadn't looked up still wouldn't meet his eyes. The other stared hard at him like she was waiting for a sign, either kindness or cruelty. She got neither. Outside, rain started again. He helped them into the wagon without touching them. Passed them each a blanket from the back. They didn't speak. The ride was long. No one broke the silence. He didn't offer comfort. He offered space. They needed that more than words. When the house came into view, Mabel, the bold one, spoke for the first time. "This where you aim to keep us?" "It's where I live," Jeb said. "You're free to leave once you've rested. No one owns no one here." Abigail flinched at the word own. But she said nothing. He showed them the two rooms. Blankets. Water basin. One locked door at the end of the hall. That one stays shut. They didn't ask why. He left them be. Later, he sat by the stove alone. Third chair still empty. The wind cried against the windows. And for the first time in 3 winters, the house wasn't silent. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Then a murmur. Then quiet again. Something had changed. He didn't know what yet, but the fire burned warmer than usual. And the locket, buried in the ground just a day earlier, felt a little less like an ending. A little more like a door. The barn was old, but still held the scent of animals, sweat, and sawdust, its rafters thick with cobwebs and the echoes of broken things. A rainstorm had blown in from the west, drumming on the warped tin roof in a rhythm that sounded too much like a heartbeat trying to outrun itself. Lanterns swung gently from hooks overhead, casting long shadows across the crude stage built from hay bales and crates. There was no velvet curtain, no sense of ceremony, just business, and a certain kind of cruelty wrapped in polite tones. They stood side by side, the two of them, their hands tied at the wrists with rough hemp cord, though no one had said they were dangerous. Mabel was the older by 10 minutes, and carried those minutes like armor. She stood tall, chin lifted, her mouth tight. Her gaze swept the room like she was memorizing every man's face for a reckoning that would come later. Abigail, by contrast, seemed elsewhere, her eyes a step behind, turned inward, as if she were watching something through water. She blinked slow, her shoulders curled slightly, protective. They were dressed the same, in gray cotton dresses stained at the hem with mud. Their boots didn't match. One had lost hers 2 towns back. No one had bothered to replace it. The crowd gathered loosely, mostly men. Some rough-faced ranchers, others in suits they wore like borrowed identities. A few with whiskey breath, none with soft eyes. They whispered as they looked at the girls, not bothering to lower their voices. "Which one you reckon bites? They come in pairs now like stock. Too pale. Not enough meat on the bones." The girls didn't flinch. Not anymore. Agnes Nolan, their stepmother in name only, stood to the side in her green silk shawl, the color sharp against her pallid skin. She held a cigarette in one hand and a smile in the other. Neither ever left her face for long. She was a woman who had perfected the art of appearing grieved while pocketing coin. "Now then," the auctioneer barked, clapping his hands like someone summoning cattle. "Next up, 2 fine young women, blood sisters, 19 years of age. Twin angels." He paused, then smirked. "Or devils, depending how you train 'em." A few men chuckled. Mabel didn't move, but her lip twitched. A warning more than a response. "Strong backs," Agnes called out, drawing attention. "Don't eat much. Raise proper. They'll work a field or warm a bed, up to the buyer. I've done all I could for them, but a woman's got her limits, and charity don't pay rent." Someone asked, "They come with papers?" "Don't need 'em," the auctioneer said. "They're orphaned. Legal enough." That wasn't true. Their mother, Eliza, had vanished 3 years ago under what was told to them as shameful circumstance. Rumors said she'd run off with a railroad man. The truth, Agnes always muttered, was too unladylike to speak aloud. She took the house, kept the girls, and sold what little they had left, bit by bit, until they were worth less as burdens than as merchandise. The bidding began low. $30. A hand went up. Mabel shifted her stance, not out of nerves, but calculation. She was trying to count exits, judge strength, measure time. Abigail barely looked up. 45, a voice rasped. 50. 60 for the pair. It slowed there. No one wanted to spend more than that on what they assumed would bring trouble. And then he stepped inside. The barn grew still, not loud or dramatic, but quietly aware of him, the way a room notices a dog that doesn't bark. Julian Kane filled the doorway like a pause in conversation. He wore no coat, just a dark shirt soaked through at the collar. And he didn't remove his hat. His eyes swept the space once, not pausing on anyone, but everyone felt it. The auctioneer blinked. "You here to bid, mister?" Jeb said nothing at first. He looked at the girls. Not through them. At them. Abigail lifted her gaze for the first time in hours. Her lips parted slightly, unsure why his silence didn't sting like the others. Agnes laughed, low and sharp. "Look at you, out in the weather for a pair of strays. You gonna fix 'em or feed 'em?" Jeb's voice was quiet, but it cut clean. "Full price." "I'll take both." The room blinked. The auctioneer blinked. I didn't ask the rate," Jeb said. "I said full." There was silence. Then a scribble of ink on paper. The auctioneer didn't want to argue. Agnes tilted her head, her voice dripping with sugar spoiled. "You sure, mister?" "Kane." She smiled like she recognized the name, though she didn't. "You just bought yourself 2 problems. They can walk?" Jeb asked, ignoring her. The girls stepped down off the platform, their ropes untied without ceremony. Mabel held her own wrist where the rope had left its mark. Abigail hesitated, then followed her sister, boots silent on the hay-covered floor. As they passed Agnes, she leaned in and whispered something neither repeated. Mabel didn't respond. Abigail's eyes flickered, then steadied. Outside, the storm had softened to a mist. Jeb's wagon stood ready, the mule steady despite the slick mud. He helped neither girl up, but he offered each a wool blanket. It wasn't kindness exactly, just preparation, survival. But the way he handed them over, without flinching, without force, was unfamiliar. They rode in silence. The road twisted through thin trees and past creeks swollen with spring runoff. The wheels creaked and rain tapped the canvas overhead. Mabel sat upright, arms crossed. Abigail leaned against the wagon side, watching the sky roll by. Now and then she'd glance at Jeb, but he kept his eyes on the trail. He didn't speak until the house appeared, half hidden by low hills and a stand of leafless cottonwoods. "It ain't big," he said, almost to himself, "but it's dry." The girls said nothing. He stopped the wagon, climbed down, and opened the gate. They followed, stepping lightly through the mud. Inside, the house was warmer than expected. A fire was lit. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and wood smoke. Jeb led them down the hall, past a door at the end with a heavy lock, and gestured to the rooms on either side. "They're yours. Water's in the basin. Food's in the pantry. You can stay as long as you need." Mabel narrowed her eyes. "And what's the catch?" "No catch. You buy us, then say we're free?" "I don't buy people," Jeb said. "I paid to keep you out of worse hands." She stared, trying to find a lie in his face. There wasn't one. Abigail spoke then, soft and uncertain. "Why?" He looked at her a long moment. Not with pity. Not with anything that could be easily named. "Couldn't walk away," he said simply. "Didn't want to." Then he turned and left them alone. They shut the doors behind them. For the first time in years, no one followed. Later, they heard him by the stove, heating something. They didn't come out. He didn't call them. Mabel sat on the floor by her bed, rubbing her wrists. Abigail lay back on the thin mattress, watching shadows on the ceiling. "He's different," Abigail whispered. Mabel didn't answer. But she didn't argue. Outside, the storm passed. And the house, for all its silence, no longer felt like a cage. The fire in the main room crackled once, as though breathing. And something small and stubborn began to stir, just beneath the skin of old wounds. The girls, Mabel and Abigail, had been in the house for 3 days now. 3 days, 2 rooms, and a door at the end of the hallway that remained locked. He hadn't said why. They hadn't asked. Not yet. He watched as the coffee in his tin mug steamed gently. He hadn't realized how used he'd grown to the sound of only one chair scraping against the floor. Now there were footsteps down the hall in the mornings. Doors clicking shut. The water pump being worked at dawn. It unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it reminded him how long it had been since the house breathed like that. In their rooms, the girls moved differently. Mabel folded things with method, made her bed each morning like she was preparing for inspection. Abigail, on the other hand, touched everything lightly, like the room might vanish if she pressed too hard. She hummed sometimes, not loud, just enough that the sound curled under the door and reached the hallway like an old song half-remembered. They didn't speak to Julian much. He didn't press them. He wasn't trying to earn anything. He gave them space, same as he gave the land, working around it until it grew used to him. On the 4th morning, Mabel stepped into the kitchen while he was pouring oats into a pot. She didn't sit, but she didn't leave either. He offered her a mug. She took it with a nod and held it in both hands, warming her fingers. "You always keep that room locked?" she asked, glancing down the hall. Jeb stirred the pot. "Yes." She didn't ask why. Abigail joined a few minutes later. Her hair was damp from snowmelt, cheeks pink from the pump. She took her mug and stood beside her sister, shoulder to shoulder, as if anchoring herself there. They ate together without saying much. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just new. By the end of that week, Mabel had fixed the latch on the barn door. Jeb watched her from the porch as she hammered the nail back in place with the edge of a brick. She moved like someone who didn't like owing anyone. Abigail had taken to the hearth, sweeping ash, scrubbing pots with lye, placing kindling just so. Each task done with precision, not from fear, but from the need to belong somewhere without permission. That night, a storm settled in. Wind howled against the corners of the house, and the chimney moaned like an old throat. They gathered near the fire, not by plan, but by gravity. Jeb in his chair, Mabel on the floor with a threadbare quilt. Abigail perched at the edge of the couch, sewing a loose button onto her coat. No one spoke at first. Jeb reached behind him and opened a box beneath the side table. Inside were books, old, worn, their spines cracked, but pages intact. He handed one toward Abigail. She blinked, surprised, then took it with both hands. "I used to read aloud," he said, softly, as though speaking it reminded him of how long it had been. "To someone who's gone now." Abigail nodded. "She must have liked stories." "She did," he said. Mabel leaned back against the hearth, staring at the flames. "This house, it's got 3 rooms, right?" "Yeah. But only 2 are open." "That's right." Silence settled again, thicker this time. Jeb didn't explain. The locked room waited like a breath held too long. The next day, Abigail found the letter. It was tucked inside the top drawer of her dresser, between a yellowed scrap of lace and a cracked mirror. She hadn't gone looking for it. She'd been rearranging things, trying to make the space feel like hers. But the envelope caught her eye, its edge barely visible beneath the lining paper. Her name wasn't on it. It was addressed simply, J. Kane. She hesitated. The seal was already broken. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was familiar in a way that struck deep, a curve in the L, a softness in the way the ink faded. The letter was dated nearly 3 years ago. It was from their mother. She read it once. Then again. The words blurred in places. Mentions of the girls, my twins, Mabel and Abigail. If they ever find their way to you. And apologies. Regret that rotted through the lines like damp. A name signed at the bottom. Eliza M. She hadn't used her married name. She never had, not even with the girls. Abigail folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket. Her hands trembled, just slightly. That evening, she approached Julian while he was tending to the fence post out back. The sun was setting, casting orange along the ridge. She stood there a moment, watching the way he worked, measured, deliberate, as if fixing might fix other things too. She held out the letter. He saw it before he took it. Recognition flashed like a match strike in his eyes. "I found it in the drawer," she said quietly. "She wrote to you." He took the paper with a hand that had steadied rifles and shovels and broken bones. But it shook now. "I didn't know," he said, voice low, hoarse. "She never told me about you. Said she had no family left." "She was our mother," Abigail whispered. "She left. We thought she was dead." He looked up at her, eyes raw. "She came here. Sick already. We married. She wanted to start over. She never spoke of her past." Why? He didn't have the answer. Only the sound of wind between them. Mabel found them standing like that, neither speaking. Her eyes flicked to the letter, then to Jeb's face, then back to Abigail. "Who is he?" she asked. Abigail's voice cracked as she said it. "Mama's husband. After she left us." Mabel didn't speak. Her jaw tensed, like something inside her was being held back by threads. "She's buried here?" she asked finally. Jeb nodded. "You didn't know about us?" "No." Abigail looked between them. "She wanted us to find him. If anything happened." She wrote it. They sat on the porch that night, all 3 of them, not quite touching. A lantern glowed softly near the door. Somewhere, an owl called once and was gone. Julian opened the locked door the next morning. He didn't say anything, just left the key on the table and walked out to the barn. Mabel turned it in her hand for a long time before she stood and crossed the hall. The lock gave with a slow groan. The air inside the room smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back. On the dresser sat a silver brush, a tin of buttons, a faded photograph of a woman with hair like Abigail's, and a smile just like Mabel's. They didn't cry. Not then. Instead, they stepped inside, one after the other, and stood in the silence that followed a truth long buried. They took down the quilts, aired out the pillows, lit a candle, and placed it in the window. That night, the door remained open. Later, while boiling water for tea, Abigail turned to Jeb. "What was she like?" she asked. He sat back, gaze far off. "Kind. Tired. She laughed at my boots being too big. She made bread even when we didn't have enough flour. Said if you fed people with your hands, they'd never leave your table." Mabel stirred the fire. "She left us." "She didn't mean to," Abigail said. "Doesn't make it easier," Mabel muttered. "No," Jeb said. "It doesn't." They stayed up late that night, all 3, not talking about grief, but about goats that wandered too far and a neighbor who tried to fix a chimney with shoe leather. Things that didn't matter, except that they did, because saying them meant they weren't pretending anymore. The snow came at last, thick and wet. It layered the roof and softened the edges of the world. And in the house, with 3 rooms, the silence had changed. It no longer rang hollow. It echoed, with memory, with warmth, with something like family, though no one dared speak the word. Not yet, not out loud. But it was there, in the fire, in the hallway where the door now stood open, and in the sound of 3 chairs scraping gently against the floor. The morning came gray and windless, the kind of hush that made birds stay quiet and branches bend as if in reverence. Frost clung to the porch rail in delicate lacework, untouched and glistening. Julian stood with one hand resting against the frame of the open doorway, a mug of coffee cooling in the other, his breath rising in thin, uncertain curls. Inside, the house was stirring. Abigail's soft footsteps moved through the kitchen, the clink of a spoon against a tin pot marking her presence like a quiet song. Mabel had already gone out before sunrise, tending to the coop, her coat buttoned to the throat, hair tucked beneath a wool cap. She was always the first to move, still mistrustful of rest, as if she feared it might be mistaken for weakness. The revelation of who Julian was, who he had unknowingly become to them, had not changed the rhythms of the house. Not exactly. But something had shifted beneath the skin of things. There was less flinching, fewer silences soaked in suspicion. Still, no one quite knew what to name the space that had opened between them, so they left it unnamed. That morning, Abigail found a book on the shelf she hadn't seen before. A collection of poems worn along the spine, pages softened by age and oil from fingers long gone. Inside, in the margin of one page, was a note in faint pencil. She liked this one. Read it again. She didn't ask who wrote it. She didn't need to. Instead, she carried the book with her and read the poem aloud while sitting on the steps after lunch, her voice tentative at first, then steadying. Julian paused from splitting wood to listen, leaning on his axe. Mabel, from where she was scraping rust off an old plow blade, kept her eyes down but didn't tell her to stop. Later that day, they all worked the southern field together, a patch of land that hadn't seen seed since Anna's last planting. The soil there had hardened with disuse, roots like bones just beneath the surface. Jeb showed them how to strike deep and pull clean. He didn't bark orders. He demonstrated, let them follow if they wanted. By dusk, the girls' hands were blistered, cheeks streaked with dirt. Jeb lit a lantern and handed out water from a shared canteen. No words, just nods. Mabel met his gaze for the first time in days. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't guarded either. That night, Abigail pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders as she watched the fire. She'd taken to sleeping in the main room some nights. Said it was warmer. The truth was, she liked the glow of the embers, the soft noises the house made after dark. It reminded her she wasn't alone. Jeb sat across from her, sharpening his knife slowly, the rhythm quiet and even. The sound had a lull to it. You think she was trying to make us a family? Abigail asked suddenly, voice low. He didn't look up. Eliza. Abigail nodded. He paused, then resumed the motion. I think she was trying to find peace. For herself. Maybe for you too. She told us nothing. Abigail murmured. She left us. And then she just became someone else. Jeb's jaw flexed, the knife stilled in his hands. She didn't want to be someone else. She was trying to survive the person she'd already been. Mabel entered then, snow in her hair, the smell of wood smoke on her coat. She caught the end of the sentence and held it in silence for a moment. I don't care why she left, she said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. She did. And that was enough. No, it wasn't, Abigail said, not cruelly. It was never enough. That's why you're still angry. Mabel looked at her, then down. Her hands balled at her sides. You're right, she whispered, barely audible. I am angry. No one responded. There was no comfort to offer. Just the truth, raw and unsweetened, laying between them like a wound finally shown in daylight. The next afternoon brought trouble. Julian spotted the rider before the girls did. a figure on horseback, trailing a crooked path up the road from town. He watched from a porch, hand resting near the old rifle propped behind the door. The girl stayed inside, unaware. The rider dismounted slowly, swaying slightly. His boots hit the ground with the staggered certainty of a man already drunk. His coat flapped loose in the wind, revealing a pistol tucked at the hip. His eyes were red-rimmed and bitter. "Name's Colby," he said when Jeb met him at the gate. "We got unfinished business." Jeb studied him. "I don't recall you. You took what was mine." "I bought no man's property." Colby's smile was broken teeth and spite. "Them girls. I had the bid. You cut me off. Thought you'd play hero. They weren't yours. And they're not mine either." Colby spat into the dirt. "They were for sale, weren't they? Like sheep. I don't forget being humiliated." Jeb's hand stayed by his side. "You need to leave. Not without a taste of justice." The gun moved too quick for talk. 1 second Colby was shifting. The next a shot rang out and the barn wall splintered. Inside, Mabel screamed. Abigail dropped the pan she was washing. Jeb dove low, rifle up, but didn't fire. He shouted, "Get inside. Stay down." Another shot cracked into the porch railing. Then silence. Jeb rose slowly, arms out, stepping forward. "No one's gonna die today, Colby. You made your point. Let it be enough." Colby's face twisted, the drink making him slow, but not stupid. "You think you can save broken things? Make 'em clean just by putting them in a better house? I think you're scared of what they might become if you don't break them first." The pause between them held something sharp. Then, from behind the porch, Mabel stepped out. "Don't," Jeb hissed. She didn't stop. Blood on her sleeve from a splinter cut. No weapon. Just fire in her eyes. "You want someone to fight?" she said, voice steel. "Then fight me." Colby sneered. "You ain't worth it." "No. But I'm standing here anyway." He stared at her, fingers twitching. Then Abigail appeared beside her. No words. Just presence. Something in Colby faltered. The image of them together, unflinching, unwounded by fear, was too much. He spat again, turned, and climbed back into the saddle. His horse hesitated, sensing the storm in his rider, then moved on. They watched him until he was gone. That night, Jeb patched a railing. Abigail wrapped Mabel's hand with a strip of cotton, fingers gentle, words unspoken. Jeb said nothing, just watched them, how they moved, how they looked out for each other, how they carried something that no bullet could steal. Later, Jeb sat in the room Anna once claimed. The bed still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. He opened the drawer where she had kept her letters and pulled out the last one she'd ever written to him. Inside was a smaller note, folded separately, not addressed, just a few lines. "If they find you, love them, even if they never know who you are, especially then." He traced the words with his thumb, eyes stinging. The next day, he brought the girls to the grove where Eliza was buried. A simple stone, no name, just a carved rose. "She's here," he said. "She asked to be buried on the land she loved." Abigail knelt. Mabel stood, arms crossed. "You think she'd have come back?" Mabel asked. "I think she hoped you'd find her," Jeb said. "She should have found us," Mabel said. No one disagreed. They stood in the cold for a long time. No prayers, no speeches, just breath and memory. That evening, Abigail painted a sign and hung it by the door. Not large, not fancy, just carved into old pine. "The 3 rooms." Mabel raised an eyebrow. "That what we're calling it?" Abigail smiled. "It's what it's always been." They ate dinner by lamplight. 3 chairs, 1 table. Jeb broke the bread, passed it without comment. Mabel raised her cup. "To what's ours?" Abigail tapped hers against it. "To what we found." Jeb nodded. "To what stays." Outside, the frost grew thick, but inside the house, the fire held. Not fierce, just steady. The way certain lights never go out, no matter how long the night. And somewhere miles away, Colby drank himself sick in a town that would soon forget him. The house with 3 rooms never did. It remembered, it welcomed, and it waited for the next truth, The next forgiveness, the next blooming thing. The days grew longer, though no one mentioned it. Snow still lined the edges of the house, but it melted quicker now, pooling into soft earth and trickling under fences, as though the land itself was sighing off its grief. Julian stood at the edge of the southern field, fingers buried in thawed soil. He let it crumble between his hands, watching how it darkened with moisture. The girls had asked to plant this year. He hadn't questioned it. Something in him had changed, not softened, not exactly, but realigned, like a bone that had been broken and set wrong finally cracked back into place. Inside, Abigail was laying seeds in the windowsill, tiny containers she'd carved from hollowed corn cobs and filled with soil. She whispered to them sometimes, not quite prayers, more like intentions. She'd found a book on botany tucked in the loft and read it each night, tracing her fingers over the illustrations as if the pages could teach her how to bring things to life. Mabel spent her mornings mending saddles and checking the fences. She'd taken to wearing one of Jeb's old hats, the brim shadowing her sharp eyes. She moved with quiet command now, no longer expecting permission, no longer waiting to be sent away. The bruises life had left on her hadn't faded, but they had stopped being the first thing anyone noticed. Jeb watched them both without speaking much. He still slept light, still checked the locks every evening before the sun fell. Some habits were scars that lived deeper than memory, but he no longer avoided the third room. He'd taken to sitting in there on rainy mornings, a cup of coffee resting on the window ledge, the scent of lavender still faint in the wood. He'd begun writing letters, small ones, tucked in a notebook he never shared. Sometimes they were to Anna, sometimes to Eliza, and once or twice to the girls. The air smelled different in March, less like wood smoke, more like things waking up. One morning, Abigail found the first green blade poking up near the creek, and she ran back breathless to tell them. Mabel followed her back with a spade and cleared the area around it, marking it with a rock. Jeb carved a line on the porch post that night. No reason, just a way to remember when things began again. Then came the letter. It arrived folded in quarters, smeared with road dust, tucked under the edge of a flour sack delivered by a passing merchant. No stamp, just a name on the outside, written in a hand that leaned forward like it was trying to outrun itself. Agnes. Mabel opened it at the table. Jeb and Abigail watched her eyes as they moved across the page. She didn't speak until the end. She wants to come, she said. Says she's sick. Dying, maybe. Says she wants to make peace. Abigail looked down. After all this time? Jeb said nothing. He didn't trust that kind of turn. The kind that comes when people feel time slipping, when ghosts gather at the corners of their vision. She wants to see us, Mabel added, her voice brittle. To tell her side. Jeb cleared his throat. What do you want? Mabel looked at him. Really looked. Then at her sister. I want her to see what she didn't ruin. They agreed. She could come. One visit. One day. Agnes arrived 3 days later, half herself. Thinner than memory. Her hands shook as she stepped down from the buggy. She wore too much perfume, as if trying to mask decay with jasmine. Abigail greeted her with a bowl of water and a cloth. Mabel stood behind her, arms crossed. Agnes smiled with lips that didn't quite part. My girls, she said. All grown. You never called us that, Abigail murmured. Agnes's face flickered. Did I not? Well, I meant to. They brought her inside, sat her near the fire. She coughed into a handkerchief stained with something dark. I was cruel, she said without prompting. Not always, but enough. I thought the world owed me comfort, and when it didn't give it, I carved what I could from others. Mabel didn't reply. Abigail nodded once, unsure if forgiveness lived in that motion. I didn't know what to do with daughters, Agnes added, voice cracking. Didn't know how to be seen. Eliza, she had something I didn't. A way of loving that didn't feel like drowning. You sold us, Mabel said quietly. Like meat. Agnes flinched. Yes. And you were saved. Look at this place. Look at you. We saved ourselves, Abigail corrected. Jeb remained at the edge of the room, listening. Agnes looked at him. You're the one she married. The one Eliza ran to. I was the one who found her broken, he replied. Same as them. The silence after that was long. When Agnes stood to leave, she moved slowly, as if every bone argued against it. At the door, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. I found this, she said, after Eliza died. Never opened it. Thought it was for me. But it's addressed to you, Julian. He stepped forward and took it. I don't ask you to forgive me, she said, voice rasping. But I ask you to remember, I didn't destroy everything. You still have each other. She left in the same buggy she came in, alone. They stood in the doorway, watching until the road swallowed her. Jeb opened the envelope by firelight. Inside was a letter in Eliza's hand, shaky but unmistakable. If this ever finds you, it means the worst has happened. I wanted to tell you more, but my time was short. I tried to become someone they could look up to again. I didn't know how to return without shame. If you ever meet them, Mabel with her stubborn heart, Abigail with her quiet wisdom, tell them I love them more than any right I ever had. Tell them they are not made of my mistakes, but of their own strength. And you, thank you for giving me peace at the end. He folded the letter with care, passed it to Mabel. She took it without a word, read it twice, handed it to Abigail, whose tears came silently, resting on the edge of her mouth like a secret. That night, they sat by the fire. Abigail played a melody on the fiddle she'd found in the loft. Jeb watched the girls from his chair, one foot tucked beneath the other. He felt something loosen in him. Some thread finally unknotted. Spring bloomed hard. They tilled the soil by hand, row after row. Abigail planted herbs in a side garden and labeled them with popsicle sticks and neat handwriting. Mabel built a chicken run from scrap wood and old nails, cursing softly as she worked. Jeb repaired the old water pump and repainted the porch. The house, with 3 rooms, no longer looked like a waiting place. It looked like a choice. And then the child arrived. A boy no older than 12, with a split lip and a coat too thin. He stumbled into the yard one dusk, eyes wide, legs shaking. Mabel caught him before he fell. Said his name was Henry. Said he'd heard about the place from a man in town. Said someone told him it was safe here. They didn't ask who. Just brought him in. Jeb made a bed in the loft. Abigail made soup. Mabel sat by the boy's side until he stopped shaking. Later, she wrote a letter and nailed it to the post in town. The 3 rooms welcomes the forgotten. Come if you've been lost. We have work, food, and no questions. They came in trickles after that. A girl who couldn't speak, but danced when music played. A teenager who carried a sack of books and asked if he could teach letters. A mother and infant, eyes wide as the prairie sky. The house grew louder, fuller. Jeb built bunk beds from pine. Abigail taught the children to plant. Mabel taught them to fight, just enough to stand up straight. And one evening, long after the last sun dipped behind the hill, Mabel sat on the porch beside Jeb. You knew she was gone when she came to you, she said. Eliza. He nodded. You loved her anyway. I did. Do you love us? She asked. It wasn't soft. It wasn't pleading. He turned to her. Yes. Without conditions. She nodded. We love you too. Inside, the house glowed, lamplight flickering in every room, voices murmuring, laughter braided into the rafters. Abigail sat near the fire, Henry curled against her, the fiddle resting nearby. Jeb reached into his coat, pulled out the deed to the land, and slid it across the porch boards to Mabel. All 3 of us, he said. Names together. It's yours as much as mine. She picked it up, held it like a torch. Then let's keep it lit. The wind rose, but the fire never faltered. And in the house, with 3 rooms, built from grief and labor and small, stubborn kindnesses, a family stayed. Not by blood, but by choice. By fire. By name.
The frost came early that February, as if winter itself had something it needed to say before it left. The wind weaved low and slow between the bare bones of the cottonwoods, brushing the edges of the Kane homestead like a hand over brittle pages. Snow drifted in layers across the porch, quieting the world with its hush. Inside, the fire cracked not with warmth but with duty, kept alive not for comfort, but because that's what you do when you live alone and the silence might otherwise speak too loud. Thaddeus Kane was not a man built for stories. His face was not a canvas for adventure, but a weather-worn ledger of days survived. Lines carved by sun and loss ran deep along his brow, and though his shoulders remained broad, they hung tired, as if they bore something that had never quite set itself down. He moved slow, not from age but from caution, as though any sudden motion might unravel the fragile thread that stitched his life together. Coffee boiled black on the stove. He didn't sip it for taste, there was none, but for rhythm. He sat by the window where the frost flowers bloomed on the glass, etching delicate patterns he never touched. Beyond the pane, the land stretched blank and bone-pale, the kind of winter prairie that made men forget what green looked like. Somewhere beyond the horizon was town, but Thaddeus hadn't gone in weeks. There was no need. The pantry still held dried beans, salt pork, and the old jar of honey his wife had once sealed with wax. He kept it though he never opened it. Not out of sentiment, but something quieter. Something that might have been hope years ago, before hope became just another chore he forgot to tend. Her name had been Miriam. She died with a whisper on her lips, too soft to catch, but he swore it had been his name. She hadn't screamed. The baby, his name was never written, hadn't cried. The room had been too clean afterward. No chaos, no miracle. Just stillness. After that, Thaddeus stopped going to church. The pastor came once, said things that were meant to be comforting. Thaddeus nodded, thanked him. Never asked him back. It was just after midday when he saw it, tracks by the fence. Not from any creature he'd seen recently. Light, barefoot, barely pressing into the crust of snow. They wove strangely, stuttering like a drunk's steps, but smaller. He followed without thinking, only grabbing his coat as an afterthought. Old Lark nickered softly from the stable as he passed, but Thaddeus didn't stop. The tracks led toward the ravine, steep and treacherous even in spring, now half-frozen and dangerous. Wind sliced sharp against his cheeks, but his boots pressed onward, methodical. He found her just past the bend. She lay curled like a question mark in the snow, arms wrapped around her middle, face half hidden by a mess of dark hair and sleet. Her dress was torn at the hem, her shawl soaked through. One hand clutched her belly protectively, the other was buried in the snow as if she'd tried to crawl. For a moment, Thaddeus only stood there, watching. Not from callousness, but uncertainty. This was the kind of thing that breaks a man a second time. Then he moved. Gently, as if handling glass. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Thin and stubborn. Her breath came in short, stuttering gasps. The swell of her stomach beneath her bodice left no room for guessing. She was near her time, and alone. He lifted her slowly, careful not to jostle more than he had to. She stirred once, muttering something, words slurred by cold and exhaustion. Her face was young, but worn. Not the kind of wear that comes from years, but from choices and running, and the kind of shame this land had no grace for. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had darkened. Dusk slid over the snow like a curtain being drawn. He pushed open the door with his back, the weight of her body pressed tight against his chest. The fire had dwindled. He laid her on the cot by the hearth, then stoked the flame high, letting it reach with greedy hands toward her still form. He worked silently, boots off. Shawl hung to dry. He peeled off her wet layers with clinical hands, wrapping her in quilts stitched by Miriam years before. He remembered the way her fingers used to bleed from the needle. She would have helped this girl without question. That thought moved him faster. When she finally opened her eyes, it was near midnight. The storm had closed in, snow hammering sideways against the windows. She blinked slowly, as if the world took effort to enter. Where? Her voice cracked, rough as sand. You're safe, he said. His voice felt foreign in the room, like it hadn't been used in days. Maybe it hadn't. She looked around, eyes wary. Her hand found her stomach. When she felt the child still moving, she exhaled. Something in her shoulders fell. You found me. He didn't answer. Just ladled warm broth into a tin mug and offered it. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling. Silence settled again, this time less severe. She sipped. He returned to the chair by the fire. The heat slowly returned to her face, coloring her cheeks with faint pink. He watched the lines of tension that hadn't left her body. Watched how even in safety, she braced for judgment. "I was walking for 2 days," she murmured, not looking at him. "Figured I'd find somewhere. Didn't expect snow." A pause. Didn't expect anyone. He didn't press. Just listened, like he was listening to the fire crack or the roof settling in the wind. "Name's Lenora," she added. "Lenora Vale." He nodded. "Thaddeus." She gave a tired smile. "That sounds like a good man's name." He didn't respond. Just reached for another log and placed it on the fire. That night, he stayed in the chair, watching as she drifted into sleep again, one hand still on her stomach. The wind howled outside like something wounded, but inside the cabin, it was different. There was breath now. 2 people and 1 coming. A fire with reason. The next morning came gray, but lighter. Thaddeus brewed coffee. He made porridge with dried cranberries, a small indulgence. She ate quietly, grateful but cautious, as if kindness had strings tied to it elsewhere. "I can leave once I get strong enough," she said after some time, her eyes not meeting his. "No one said you had to." That surprised her. He saw it. Saw the way her lip almost trembled before she pulled it steady. People had judged her. That much was clear. Her eyes told stories he didn't ask for, and her silence told the rest. She wasn't weak, but she was wounded in places unseen. Later, while she slept, Thaddeus stepped outside to check the fence line. Snow still blanketed the earth, but it was softening, hinting at the idea of melt. He looked out across the land that had for so long felt like a coffin he chose to lie down in. Now it felt, not alive, but aware. There was someone else breathing here now. That night, before he slept, he took the old book down from the shelf. Miriam's favorite. The pages still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. He turned to a page she used to dog-ear and read aloud, not to Lenora, but to the room. "In the depths of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." Lenora stirred in her sleep, murmured something soft. He sat back, eyes on the fire. The snow still fell, but slower now. There were words yet unspoken, wounds yet untended, but for the first time in years, the silence inside the cabin did not feel like grief. It felt like a beginning. The snow fell softer now, like it, too, had grown weary of bitterness. It draped itself along the windowsill in gentle layers, muting the outside world to a lull. Inside the cabin, time moved in quiet loops, fire to pot, spoon to bowl, breath to silence. Lenora Vale stirred beneath the quilt with slow, cautious movements, as though waking might summon the cold back in. She looked different in daylight, her face less drawn, eyes clearer though still guarded. A woman who had learned to flinch before life spoke. Thaddeus had risen before dawn, as always. The rhythm of his days had not changed, only the weight within them. Now there was a second set of footprints on the floor, a second bowl to wash. He didn't mind. He hadn't known how loud his life had been until someone else's silence filled it differently. She hadn't asked many questions, and neither had he. That unspoken agreement stretched between them like an old bridge, fragile but holding. She watched him work, quiet and still, but always watching. When he brought her water or tucked another log into the fire, she studied his hands. Not with suspicion. Just recognition. She too had worked. Those weren't the eyes of a girl raised soft. "You don't talk much," she said one morning, her voice dry from sleep. He glanced at her over his shoulder, one hand elbow-deep in bread dough. "No use in spilling what don't need spilling." A soft smile touched her lips, and then faded like she'd remembered not to smile too easily. Her strength returned slow. She was thin, bones sharp beneath skin, but she moved now without swaying. The baby, her boy, she said, shifted often, making her wince sometimes. She never complained. She helped when she could, folding laundry, stirring pots, humming low lullabies that she didn't seem aware she sang. He never interrupted her when she sang. On the third day, he found her outside, standing barefoot on the step. Snow still clung to the earth, but had receded enough to reveal the black earth beneath in patches. "You shouldn't be out in that," he said gently. I needed to breathe. Her hands rested on her stomach. "He kicks harder when I stay still too long. Like he's reminding me I'm still here." He didn't argue. Just handed her a folded shawl and stood beside her, eyes on the pale hills. "You married?" she asked after a pause. "I was." She didn't press. But her silence wasn't empty. It was full of what she didn't ask. Back inside, she sat by the fire while he whittled a new handle for the broom. The old one had cracked, splintered too fine to mend. She watched the shavings fall like curls of pale bark onto the floor. "I was supposed to be married," she said softly. He glanced up. "He said the child wasn't his. I told him it was. He said that didn't matter." She drew in a slow breath. "He wore a preacher's collar. Had a voice that made women forget their own. I was foolish. I thought maybe if I believed hard enough, it would make me right in his eyes." Thaddeus didn't respond. He sanded the wood slow, deliberate. "I didn't run right away. I waited too long. The town turned their faces from me, one by one, like shutters closing. They wouldn't look, but they wouldn't forget." "I understand," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to. I do anyway." She turned toward the fire. Her hands trembled slightly, but her shoulders held straight. That was the first time he saw how strong she truly was, not in how she stood, but in how she refused to bow to shame. That evening, he brought down a bundle from the loft. Old baby linens, yellowed but clean, sewn by Miriam years ago. He laid them on the table without a word. Lenora touched them like she was afraid they'd crumble. "She made them before." He didn't finish. Lenora nodded. "They're beautiful." Later, as she sat brushing out her hair near the hearth, she said, "You treat me like I'm not a burden." "You're not." Her eyes shimmered then, not with tears, but with the sharp relief of being believed. The next day, the sheriff came. A knock, 3 firm raps, broke the quiet. Thaddeus opened the door to a gust of cold wind and a pair of narrowed eyes beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Kane," Sheriff Baudet greeted. "Heard rumors you've got company." Thaddeus didn't move from the doorway. "And if I do?" "Just looking to keep order. You know how folks get when they smell scandal." Thaddeus didn't answer. The sheriff craned his neck slightly, trying to see past him into the cabin. "She ain't hurting nobody," Thaddeus said, calm as stone. The sheriff scratched his chin. "Word is, that girl from Clove Hill went missing a week ago. Pregnant, unmarried. Preachers involved. You wouldn't know anything about that. No more than what you just said." Baudet sighed. "Just be careful. This town don't forget easy." Thaddeus shut the door without another word. Lenora stood by the hearth, eyes downcast, hands gripping her shawl. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. Saw the fear, the apology, the exhaustion of carrying blame that wasn't hers. "You've nothing to be sorry for," he said, and that was all. After that, she kept more to herself for a day or two, as if she feared her presence might cost him something he hadn't offered. But when he left to cut more firewood, she met him outside with her hands wrapped around a flask of tea, steam curling into the cold air. "You shouldn't carry all the weight," she said, handing it to him. "I've carried heavier." "I know," she replied. That night, she sat closer to the fire than before. The baby stirred inside her, and she rested both hands on her belly, closing her eyes. "Sometimes I think he knows when I'm scared," she whispered. "He does," Thaddeus said. "Babies know more than we give 'em credit for." He didn't tell her how he used to hum to Miriam's belly. How he spoke to a son who never got to cry. Some truths were too tender for words. She glanced at him, a trace of something. When she reached for a blanket, he passed it to her without a word. And when their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. The days unfolded with slow, careful rhythm. She began to cook more, adjusting his recipes with herbs he'd long forgotten to use. She mended his shirts with small, neat stitches. And when the wind howled loud enough to rattle the chimney, she'd read from his wife's old book of verses. Her voice was softer than the storm, but stronger than it, too. In return, he built her a stool for the hearth, sanded smooth from cherry wood, and lined with a cushion. He didn't say it was for her comfort. She didn't say thank you. But the next morning, she sat on it with a mug of tea and stayed there, humming. Their peace was not dramatic. It did not come in the form of declarations or passions. It came in the small things: shared silence, familiar glances, the slow braiding of two lives not yet ready to name what they were becoming. On the 8th night, as the fire faded low and the baby rolled beneath her ribs like a tide, Lenora said softly, "I used to think love was loud, that it had to be thunder to be real." Thaddeus didn't speak, but he turned toward her. She looked at him, calm and certain. "But now I think maybe it's the quiet things. The things that don't ask, don't take. Just stay." She looked down, as if the weight of what she'd said embarrassed her. Thaddeus reached into the firebox and stirred the coals, then added another log. The glow spread, casting warm gold across the walls. "Sometimes quiet's the only thing that lasts," he said. She looked back at him, something deepening behind her gaze. Not hope, not yet, but the start of its shape. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt. Only a little. Only just enough to suggest that winter might be ready to loosen its grip. Inside, warmth lingered, not just from fire, but from presence. The room held them gently, like the pause between heartbeats. Not an end. Not a beginning. But the breath before both. The days lengthened quietly, each one stretching its fingers a little farther into the evening. The snow no longer sat heavy on the ground, but thinned into patches, reluctant and slow to release its hold. Ice melted in trickles down the sloped roof of the cabin, forming puddles that reflected a sky beginning, at last, to soften. The land was not yet blooming, but it was no longer sleeping either. Thaddeus noticed it first in the way the sparrows returned to the fence posts, then in the sound of water moving beneath the frostbitten creek. Inside, the cabin held a different rhythm now. The silence remained, but it was no longer hollow. It was shared, weighted, familiar. There were two lives moving in tandem now, never crowding but always orbiting. Thaddeus found himself rising a little earlier, just to stoke the fire before she woke, and Lenora began humming more often, her voice light, like breath made music. These were not grand changes, but slow ones, woven like thread into the cloth of daily life. He built her an easel one afternoon. It wasn't asked for, only imagined. He found scraps of pine in the shed, sanded them until they were smooth as driftwood. When he carried it inside and set it by the window, she stared at it for a long moment before touching the wood. "I told you once I used to draw," she said, fingers tracing the grain. "How'd you remember?" He didn't answer. Just handed her a roll of brown parchment and a stick of charcoal he'd found in the bottom of a drawer. She smiled without saying thank you. The next morning, there were smudges on her fingertips and a sketch of the wood stove resting on the easel. She said it was nothing, but he thought it looked like home. The baby stirred more now. Sometimes Lenora would pause mid-sentence, hand against her belly, eyes narrowing as though listening to something only she could hear. She spoke to the child often, softly, naming the world for him in fragments. "That's the sound of fire," she'd say. "And that creak, that's the roof settling. It's old, but it holds." She never spoke of his father. That absence was sacred and untouched. One night, she asked Thaddeus if he believed in beginnings. He was sharpening a blade near the fire, the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel cutting through the quiet. "Beginnings," he echoed. "Yeah," she said, her voice hushed. "Like, after everything, do you think we get to start again?" He studied the knife in his hands for a long moment before replying. "I think we don't start over. I think we carry the pieces, find ways to fit them different." She seemed to consider that, nodding once. "That's what this feels like," she murmured. "Not new. Just mended." She looked at him then, not searching, not questioning, just looking, seeing. He felt it deep in his ribs, that quiet act of being noticed. Their bond grew in pieces, quiet moments of shared breath, glances across the table, and the occasional brush of hands when passing the firewood. There was no rush to it, no hunger. Just the steady unfolding of trust. He taught her how to repair the latch on the cellar door. Her fingers were swift and nimble, quicker than his in the small, fussy tasks. She leaned close to observe the way he twisted wire, brow furrowed in focus. When their hands met over the hinge, neither flinched. Instead, her fingers lingered a moment longer than needed, and she met his gaze without retreat. "I like fixing things," she said. "I used to think I was too broken for that. But mending something, it feels like making a promise." He nodded. "Sometimes the broken ones mend better than the whole." She smiled, slow and quiet. "Maybe people too." That night, he read from the worn poetry book again. His voice was low, uncertain, but steady. She listened with her eyes closed, head tilted back, hands resting on the life inside her. When he paused, she asked him to keep going, and he did, his voice filling the cabin with lines that once belonged to Miriam, now shared in new rhythm. On the 7th day of thaw, Lenora ventured outside alone. She walked slow, cautious. The world was slick with melting, the ground soft beneath her boots. Thaddeus watched her from the porch, not out of worry, but reverence. She moved like someone who had learned to survive her own undoing. When she returned, cheeks pink from the wind, she handed him a handful of crocus blossoms. Their purple petals were fragile, trembling. "First bloom I've seen all season," she said. "Felt wrong not to share it." He placed them in a chipped mug by the window. They didn't speak of it again, but each time he glanced at those petals, he felt something wordless press against his chest. Later that week, a letter arrived. It came by courier, folded neatly, sealed with wax. Lenora took it in shaking hands, eyes darting over the familiar script. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it on the table and stared at it for hours. "It's from my aunt," she said finally. "She's the only one who ever showed me kindness." He nodded, waiting. "I wrote her weeks ago, before the baby started kicking. I told her where I might be. I didn't expect her to write back." Her voice was dry. "Or care." She opened it that evening, her hands trembling. Thaddeus sat across the room, near enough to anchor her, far enough to let her choose. The letter was short, penned in sweeping loops. "She wants to come," Lenora said, folding it again. "Says she has people, resources, that I shouldn't be doing this alone." He looked at her carefully. "Do you want her here?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Part of me still wants to be wanted." That truth hung heavy in the air. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "It's all right to want more than survival." She looked at him then, and in her gaze was something fragile and brave. "Do you think I've ruined everything? That I'm too much for anyone to carry?" He didn't look away. "I think you've carried more than your share. And you're still standing." That night, she cried softly beneath the quilt, her back turned to him. He didn't intrude. Just sat in the rocking chair, eyes on the fire, letting her know she wasn't alone. The next morning, she was up early, kneading bread with flour-dusted fingers. She moved with purpose. There was a new calm to her, not peace, but readiness. Like someone who had faced the storm within and found herself still intact. They shared breakfast in silence, but it was a silence filled with understanding. A language without need for words. Later, she brought him a sketch, one he hadn't seen her working on. It was of him, seated by the fire, eyes distant, hands folded in thought. "I hope that's all right," she said, offering it. He took it gently. "No one's drawn me before. You looked like someone remembering something. I wanted to keep it." He nodded, throat tight. "It's a good likeness." She smiled, but there was a question in her eyes. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" He looked at the drawing, then at her. "Sometimes. But if they had, I might never have found you in the snow." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached for his hand. He let her take it. Outside, the melt continued. Icicles fell from the eaves with soft crashes. The land began to breathe again. They spent the afternoon clearing the shed, moving supplies, preparing for spring. She laughed once, clear and sudden, when a squirrel darted out from under a box of nails, and the sound startled him. He chuckled too, a low, rumbling thing that hadn't surfaced in years. She looked at him, surprised by his laugh, and he shrugged. "Guess you woke it up." That night, she rested on the cot by the fire, her hand rising and falling with the movement of the child inside her. He sat nearby, fixing the heel of her worn boot with careful stitches. "When he comes," she said, "I want you to be there." He looked up, needle paused. "You sure?" She nodded. "You've seen me at my weakest, and never once turned away." He finished the stitch, tying it off. "Then I'll be there." In the quiet that followed, something shifted. The space between them no longer held the ache of strangers or the weight of circumstance. It held choice. She leaned back, eyes closing, lips curved with something gentle. He watched her, and for the first time in years, the knot in his chest loosened. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. The crocus petals had begun to curl inward, their bloom brief but beautiful. Outside, spring whispered at the door. Inside, something softer had taken root, uncertain, unnamed, but growing all the same. The thaw came fast that week, as if winter had tired of its own bitterness and fled in haste, leaving the ground to gasp and shift beneath the sudden warmth. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and pine resin. Roofs wept with melting ice. The creek that had slept in silence for months now gurgled restlessly, swelling with runoff and memory. Inside the cabin, the warmth had settled into the bones of the place. The fire burned less urgently, windows stayed cracked a little longer, and laughter, quiet, infrequent, but real, had begun to find its place among the daily sounds. Thaddeus moved with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. His steps no longer echoed like the last word in an empty room. Lenora's presence, constant, gentle, had seeped into the walls like sunlight. But the body, no matter how hardened by years or softened by change, remains what it is, finite, fragile. And so, too, is peace. That morning, the sky had worn a gray shawl, draped heavy and low, but there was no threat in it. Thaddeus had gone to split wood, stacking it by the shed in neat, square towers. Lenora, swollen with the weight of her nearing birth, had taken to pacing the length of the porch slowly, hand at her back, the other on the rail. The baby was restless. "He's trying to leave me early," she said with a breathless smile when Thaddeus passed her a cup of tea. Thaddeus watched her carefully. "You sure you should be walking out here?" She lifted a brow. "I've walked through worse." That was true. She had walked through storms, both sky-born and man-made, and still stood. But even so, he lingered nearby, splitting smaller logs with short, precise strokes. She stepped out past the porch, just a little, where the slush had cleared into gravel and stubborn grass. Then it happened. A simple misstep. A patch of soft mud. Her foot slipped sideways, and she went down in a breathless gasp, clutching at the air as if it might hold her. Thaddeus was at her side before his axe hit the ground, kneeling in the cold earth, hands searching for hers. "I'm all right," she said, though her face said otherwise. "Just slipped. Just winded." But then the pain came. She doubled over, one hand pressing to her belly, the other gripping his arm so hard it left a bruise. Thaddeus scooped her up without a word, his breath already ragged. Her weight wasn't much, but every step back toward the cabin felt steeper than the last. He felt something shift in his chest, not a break, not yet, but a warning. The ache settled deep. Inside, he laid her on the cot, lit the stove with trembling hands, and wet a cloth for her forehead. "Thaddeus," she whispered, face pale. "I think it's time." He nodded, though the words didn't make sense to him yet. He moved like a man through fog, his hands following instinct, memory, prayers never spoken aloud. Her labor began just past midday. The hours that followed blurred into heat, sweat, and silence broken only by her sharp breaths. He held her hand when she reached for it. He braced her shoulders when she trembled. He whispered encouragement he didn't know he remembered, fragments from some other life, back when he still believed that speaking gently might change an outcome. But as the sun began to fall, so did he. He'd stood too long, forgotten to eat. His knees buckled without ceremony, dropping him beside the hearth. His head swam. His chest tightened. The world narrowed to firelight and a woman's cries. "Thaddeus," she gasped between waves of pain. He tried to answer, to lift his hand, to show her he was still there. But the dark came quick. Lenora couldn't move to help him. Not yet. The child pushed down like thunder rolling beneath her ribs. She called his name again, and when he didn't answer, something in her broke, but only for a moment. She turned inward. She breathed through the firestorm. She remembered the herbs Miriam had kept in the tin marked with lace. She remembered the poems Thaddeus read at dusk. She remembered the warmth of his hand in hers and the strength he carried not just in muscle but in gentleness. So she bore down. Alone, but not abandoned. Night came. The stars blinked open above a sky scrubbed clean by wind. Inside, the cabin smelled of blood, sweat, and smoke. A cry rang out, thin, uncertain, then grew strong. A newborn sound, wild and ancient. Lenora wept when she heard it, not from pain, but awe. The child lay wrapped in her arms, red-faced and furious, a boy with lungs full of protest and life. She named him Eli. Only then did she turn to Thaddeus. He was pale, lips dry, face slack in the shadows. She crawled to him, weak and shivering, the baby swaddled against her chest. Her hands found his pulse, faint, but there. She whispered his name, touched his brow, lit a second fire. Then she waited. For 3 days, he burned. Fever took him deep into memory. He murmured things she didn't understand. Names not hers. Apologies. Prayers. She fed him broth in spoonfuls, bathed his face with water, held his hand through the shaking. When he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. She was there, sitting at his side, Eli asleep across her chest. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards. The crocus blooms had returned to the windowsill, delicate and proud. "You came back," she said, voice cracking. His eyes moved to the bundle in her arms. "Is he?" "He's here. He's perfect." He tried to sit, groaned, and fell back. "I thought I couldn't." "You were there when I needed you," she said softly. "So I stayed when you needed me." He closed his eyes. A tear slipped past one, carving a line down his unshaven cheek. Outside, the sound of wheels on dirt broke the stillness. Lenora rose slowly, her legs still sore, and moved to the window. Her aunt's letter had spoken of plans, and now those plans had arrived. A line of ornate stagecoaches crept down the trail toward the homestead, painted, polished, regal against the muddy earth. Men in dark coats and tall hats rode beside them. She counted 4 coaches, maybe 5. She turned back to Thaddeus. "They've come." He nodded once, slow. "Do you want me to go with them?" He didn't answer. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked, quieter. Still no answer. Instead, he looked at Eli, then at her, then closed his eyes again. "I want whatever brings you peace," he said at last. The coaches pulled up outside. The door to the lead carriage opened, and a woman stepped down, gray-haired, straight-backed, eyes sharp with worry and wealth. Lenora stepped out to meet her, holding Eli close. Thaddeus watched from the window, his breath slow, his body still weak. They spoke in low tones. There were tears, hands grasped, a laugh like surprise. Lenora shook her head, then nodded. The older woman looked toward the house, toward the window where Thaddeus sat, and her face softened. She touched her heart once, then turned to speak to one of the men. They brought crates of supplies, linen, fruit, even a crib carved with doves. No one crossed the threshold without Lenora's nod. No one took what was not needed. That evening, The coaches remained parked beneath the trees, their lanterns glowing like stars fallen to earth. But no one left the house. Eli slept in the cradle. Lenora sat beside Thaddeus, their chairs close, knees nearly touching. "I could have gone with them," she said. "Could have started fresh. If cared for." He nodded. "But it wouldn't have been the same." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't." She took his hand, gently, like a promise unfolding. Outside, the wind changed again, cool, but not cold. The kind of breeze that carried seeds, that whispered of roots waiting just beneath the surface. The fall had come, sudden, unyielding, but it had not broken them. It had revealed who would catch whom when the world slipped, and who would stay. The morning that followed was unlike any other. It began not with the hiss of the kettle or the scrape of boots on floorboards, but with birdsong, clear, unbroken, bold. Spring had arrived not with a shout but with a whisper, and the earth, at last, listened. Light poured through the cabin windows in golden sheets, soft as mercy. Dust motes danced in it like old spirits come home. Thaddeus Kane opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from something longer than sleep. His breath came steady, his limbs still aching but rooted again in the present. The fever was gone. In its place remained only a gentle exhaustion and a sensation he had forgotten: peace. He turned his head and found Lenora sleeping beside the cradle. One arm draped protectively over its edge, the other curled beneath her cheek. Her hair fell across her face in soft waves, lips slightly parted, breath slow and deep. She looked impossibly young in that moment, though her journey had aged her in places no clock could reach. The baby, Eli, slept quietly, a tiny hand curled into a fist near his chin. His chest rose and fell with rhythmic insistence, a steady reminder that life, in its quiet way, had chosen to remain. Thaddeus sat up. The room shifted with him, but he held steady. He let the moment settle on him, the weight of it, the light, the scent of firewood and milk and something newly begun. When Lenora stirred, her eyes met his instantly. Alert. Protective. She blinked twice, then smiled, not wide, not exaggerated, just a gentle upturn of truth. "You're awake," she said. He nodded, voice still caught somewhere between silence and relief. "You nearly died," she added, reaching for a cup of water, placing it in his hands. "But you didn't." He drank slowly. The water was cool, clean. When he finished, he held the cup for a long time, staring into its emptiness. "You saved me." She didn't deny it, just stood and moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain. The stagecoaches were still there, gleaming in the sunlight, their horses quietly grazing, men lounging beside the wagons. Her aunt had insisted on staying, at least until things settled. She offered help, funds, a home elsewhere. Lenora had thanked her, sincerely. But she hadn't taken the offer. The frost came early that February, as if winter itself had something it needed to say before it left. The wind weaved low and slow between the bare bones of the cottonwoods, brushing the edges of the Kane homestead like a hand over brittle pages. Snow drifted in layers across the porch, quieting the world with its hush. Inside, the fire cracked not with warmth but with duty, kept alive not for comfort, but because that's what you do when you live alone and the silence might otherwise speak too loud. Thaddeus Kane was not a man built for stories. His face was not a canvas for adventure, but a weather-worn ledger of days survived. Lines carved by sun and loss ran deep along his brow, and though his shoulders remained broad, they hung tired, as if they bore something that had never quite set itself down. He moved slow, not from age but from caution, as though any sudden motion might unravel the fragile thread that stitched his life together. Coffee boiled black on the stove. He didn't sip it for taste, there was none, but for rhythm. He sat by the window where the frost flowers bloomed on the glass, etching delicate patterns he never touched. Beyond the pane, the land stretched blank and bone-pale, the kind of winter prairie that made men forget what green looked like. Somewhere beyond the horizon was town, but Thaddeus hadn't gone in weeks. There was no need. The pantry still held dried beans, salt pork, and the old jar of honey his wife had once sealed with wax. He kept it though he never opened it. Not out of sentiment, but something quieter. Something that might have been hope years ago, before hope became just another chore he forgot to tend. Her name had been Miriam. She died with a whisper on her lips, too soft to catch, but he swore it had been his name. She hadn't screamed. The baby, his name was never written, hadn't cried. The room had been too clean afterward. No chaos, no miracle. Just stillness. After that, Thaddeus stopped going to church. The pastor came once, said things that were meant to be comforting. Thaddeus nodded, thanked him. Never asked him back. It was just after midday when he saw it, tracks by the fence. Not from any creature he'd seen recently. Light, barefoot, barely pressing into the crust of snow. They wove strangely, stuttering like a drunk's steps, but smaller. He followed without thinking, only grabbing his coat as an afterthought. Old Lark nickered softly from the stable as he passed, but Thaddeus didn't stop. The tracks led toward the ravine, steep and treacherous even in spring, now half-frozen and dangerous. Wind sliced sharp against his cheeks, but his boots pressed onward, methodical. He found her just past the bend. She lay curled like a question mark in the snow, arms wrapped around her middle, face half hidden by a mess of dark hair and sleet. Her dress was torn at the hem, her shawl soaked through. One hand clutched her belly protectively, the other was buried in the snow as if she'd tried to crawl. For a moment, Thaddeus only stood there, watching. Not from callousness, but uncertainty. This was the kind of thing that breaks a man a second time. Then he moved. Gently, as if handling glass. He knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Thin and stubborn. Her breath came in short, stuttering gasps. The swell of her stomach beneath her bodice left no room for guessing. She was near her time, and alone. He lifted her slowly, careful not to jostle more than he had to. She stirred once, muttering something, words slurred by cold and exhaustion. Her face was young, but worn. Not the kind of wear that comes from years, but from choices and running, and the kind of shame this land had no grace for. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had darkened. Dusk slid over the snow like a curtain being drawn. He pushed open the door with his back, the weight of her body pressed tight against his chest. The fire had dwindled. He laid her on the cot by the hearth, then stoked the flame high, letting it reach with greedy hands toward her still form. He worked silently, boots off. Shawl hung to dry. He peeled off her wet layers with clinical hands, wrapping her in quilts stitched by Miriam years before. He remembered the way her fingers used to bleed from the needle. She would have helped this girl without question. That thought moved him faster. When she finally opened her eyes, it was near midnight. The storm had closed in, snow hammering sideways against the windows. She blinked slowly, as if the world took effort to enter. Where? Her voice cracked, rough as sand. You're safe, he said. His voice felt foreign in the room, like it hadn't been used in days. Maybe it hadn't. She looked around, eyes wary. Her hand found her stomach. When she felt the child still moving, she exhaled. Something in her shoulders fell. You found me. He didn't answer. Just ladled warm broth into a tin mug and offered it. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling. Silence settled again, this time less severe. She sipped. He returned to the chair by the fire. The heat slowly returned to her face, coloring her cheeks with faint pink. He watched the lines of tension that hadn't left her body. Watched how even in safety, she braced for judgment. I was walking for 2 days, she murmured, not looking at him. Figured I'd find somewhere. Didn't expect snow. A pause. Didn't expect anyone. He didn't press. Just listened, like he was listening to the fire crack or the roof settling in the wind. Name's Lenora, she added. Lenora Vale. He nodded. Thaddeus. She gave a tired smile. That sounds like a good man's name. He didn't respond. Just reached for another log and placed it on the fire. That night, he stayed in the chair, watching as she drifted into sleep again, one hand still on her stomach. The wind howled outside like something wounded, but inside the cabin, it was different. There was breath now. 2 people and 1 coming. A fire with reason. The next morning came gray, but lighter. Thaddeus brewed coffee. He made porridge with dried cranberries, a small indulgence. She ate quietly, grateful but cautious, as if kindness had strings tied to it elsewhere. "I can leave once I get strong enough," she said after some time, her eyes not meeting his. "No one said you had to." That surprised her. He saw it. Saw the way her lip almost trembled before she pulled it steady. People had judged her. That much was clear. Her eyes told stories he didn't ask for, and her silence told the rest. She wasn't weak, but she was wounded in places unseen. Later, while she slept, Thaddeus stepped outside to check the fence line. Snow still blanketed the earth, but it was softening, hinting at the idea of melt. He looked out across the land that had for so long felt like a coffin he chose to lie down in. Now it felt, not alive, but aware. There was someone else breathing here now. That night, before he slept, he took the old book down from the shelf. Miriam's favorite. The pages still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. He turned to a page she used to dog-ear and read aloud, not to Lenora, but to the room. In the depths of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. Lenora stirred in her sleep, murmured something soft. He sat back, eyes on the fire. The snow still fell, but slower now. There were words yet unspoken, wounds yet untended, but for the first time in years, the silence inside the cabin did not feel like grief. It felt like a beginning.